Hi everyone, I'm David Fisher, and this is Presidential Perspectives, where we take a look at current events through the lens of American history, as seen through the lives of the presidents of the United States. The focus of today's episode is Annex Canada. President Donald Trump has made it clear his intention is to try to make Canada the 51st state in the Union. The question, historical perspective, is, have the Americans ever tried to annex Canada in the past? The answer to that is yes, and in this episode we're going to focus on that issue as well as other things to do with U.S.-Canadian relations over the years, including the border, things like trade. It goes back to the very beginning. The Treaty of Paris, John Adams, part of the negotiating team to bring the Revolutionary War finally to a close, and he was concerned about his fellow New Englanders no longer having access to the fisheries off of Newfoundland. Americans were no longer going to be part of the British Empire. They weren't going to have the defense of the British military, and they potentially weren't going to have access to British territory like this. And those fisheries were a big part of the livelihood of the folks in New England. Adams successfully negotiated this into the Treaty of Paris, but like many things in that treaty, a lot of things were remaining in dispute for many, many years. The next thing that really came to a head for the Americans, and the one time they really did go after Canada to try to bring it into the American Union, occurred around the time of the War of 1812. What was going on here? Well, there were Americans suffering depredations on the high seas, both at the hands of the French and particularly the British, who French and the British were at war with each other over in Europe. That made anything the Americans were doing in trade with either of the other. That meant that they were trying to aid the enemy. The British in particular were sacking American ships and taking Americans basically hostage and impressing them into the British Navy. All of this were reasons that the Americans were thinking about going to war against the British, but it wasn't the only reason. There were folks out west, the war hawks out west, led by a man from Kentucky, a young congressman by the name of Henry Clay, said, look, this is an opportunity. The British have all their soldiers and sailors fighting Napoleon in Europe. They're not really focusing on North America. Canada is lightly guarded. Let's go in, invade Canada, bring it into the Union, expand the American frontier. This was another reason potentially to go to war. Well, by June of 1812, President James Madison was convinced it's time to ask Congress for a declaration of war, saying that the British carries on a war against the lawful commerce of a friend, that she may better carry on a commerce with an enemy. Congress needed to decide whether the Americans would continue passive under these progressive usurpations or begin to respond in kind. It was a little bit of a close vote, but Congress did authorize the declaration of war. Now, well, a lot of the folks were focused on the things going on the high seas. Those folks in the West, they were ready to go after Canada, and it didn't go very well. First, the American militia and the regular army had sort of disputes about who was in charge and what was the battle plans and the tactics. Eventually, by April of 1813, the Americans did go into Upper Canada and actually captured the capital of that region called York, now currently called Toronto, but they went a little bit too far. In York, they actually burned some of the Parliament buildings there. They didn't hold the town for very long, just a couple of weeks, but it really sparked outrage on behalf of not only the local Canadians, but also the British. So after the British defeated Napoleon, now had a whole bunch more soldiers and sailors to send to North America to fight in this War of 1812, they set their sights immediately on the U.S. capital of Washington, D.C. They landed, they put the men there, and they set the torch, burning the White House, burning the Capitol building, basically as revenge for what the Americans had done in York. Now, Secretary of State James Monroe complained about this to the British, saying that in the course of 10 years past, the capitals of the principal powers of the continent of Europe have been conquered and occupied alternatively by the victorious armies of each other, and no instance of such wanton and unjustifiable destruction has been seen. But frankly, Monroe didn't have a lot of leg to stand on here because of what the Americans had done in York. Now, the real battle between the Americans and the Canadians on the border here that really went the Americans' way took place in the Great Lakes, the Grand Triumph of Oliver Perry, September of 1813. Perry's U.S. Navy taking on the mighty British in Lake Erie, and it didn't start out very well. In fact, Perry's flagship originally was defeated. He had to leave, emblazoned with a sign that said, "Don't give up the ship." He made it to another ship, and a tremendous victory for the Americans over the British on Lake Erie, giving Perry the opportunity to claim, "We have met the enemy and they are ours." What did this do? Well, it opened up things for the Army under Major General William Henry Harrison to go recapture Detroit and look to kick the British and their Indian allies out of this region. They chased down General Henry Proctor, also Tecumseh, the great warrior for the Indians. They caught him at the Battle of the Thames, a big victory for William Henry Harrison and the Americans, again evicting the British and the Indians out out of that area, and a lot of praise for Harrison. The Richmond compilers saying his cautious and cool, deliberate valor inspire universal confidence and point him out to be the safe as well as the able conductor of our armies. The public opinion is very much in his favor and will designate him for the conqueror of Canada. Maybe that annexing of Canada might actually happen. It did not. As a year later, finally the treaty that brought this war to an end, the Treaty of Ghent, the agreement between the Americans and the British was status quo antebellum. We're going to have no change from before the war, revert to all the old borders, and this would actually be the last time the Americans would formally try to capture and annex Canada. Again, status quo antebellum. Canadian relations with the United States, where there are issues about border and trade off and on throughout big parts of the 19th century, the latter part of the 1830s was a critical element to this. Canadians had some of the rebels of their own, led by a man named William Mackenzie, who decided to actually break away from Canada and capture an island right on the border. In fact, it was in the middle of the Niagara River, right on the border between New York and Canada, and it was called Navy Island. And this group under Mackenzie captured it, and they were actually trying to encourage the Americans to come to their aid and actually rebel against Canada. But Martin Van Buren, the President of the United States at the time, said, we're not getting involved in this. We're completely neutral. He sent his general, Winfield Scott, to the region just to make sure that no American militia was going to take up arms in this. Now, there were some Americans who were doing some supply runs to Navy Island to support some of these rebels, and the Canadian militia came in to put a stop to this. They actually captured a ship called the Caroline. They set it ablaze with all of its stores, and they sent it right over the edge of Niagara Falls. But again, the Americans did not retaliate for this. They were seeking to stay neutral in this sort of internal Canadian battle. A more serious engagement actually occurred later in Van Buren's administration, and this had to do again with a territorial dispute between the relatively new state of Maine and the territory of New Brunswick. They were fighting over land. About 12,000 square miles were in dispute, and this wasn't about the fisheries anymore. This was about timber, the lumber industry, very lucrative, both sides of the border, and there was jockeying for position about who owned what territory. And in fact, it was getting pretty heated, both sides calling out their local militia, and the U.S. Congress actually stepped in to give President Van Buren the authority to raise up to 50,000 troops, spend $10 million if the president needed to, if he actually had to go to war with Canada over this particular border dispute. Well, again, Martin Van Buren was seeking a diplomatic solution that he passed along to his successors. That former general, William Henry Harrison, spent about a month in the White House before he passed. He then had his successor, John Tyler, who was very much interested in solving this dispute of this land dispute between New Brunswick and Maine. He had his Secretary of State, Daniel Webster, focus on this, and the British seemed inclined to have an agreement. They agreed to send Alexander Baring, otherwise known as Lord Ashburton, to the United States, to the nation's capital of the U.S., and actually get into negotiations with Daniel Webster, and they came up with an agreement essentially to split the difference. The Americans got a little bit better of the deal. 7,000 square miles went to the U.S., 5,000 square miles went to the Canadians, and the American government agreed to pay the states of Massachusetts and Maine $125,000 each because they were sort of losing territory in their minds. Basically, everybody came away happy, including President John Tyler. According to Tyler, he said, the peace of the country when I reached Washington on the 6th day of April, 1841, was suspended by a thread. But we, Webster and he, converted that thread into a chain cable of sufficient strength to render that peace secure. Very proud of the Webster-Ashburton deal. It had been 67 years since the start of the Revolutionary War, and this was the first real positive agreement, actually, between the Americans and the British in that entire time. Well, John Tyler's successor, James Polk, wanted to take things a next step further. This was on the western side of the continent, in the area called the Oregon Territory. Now, Polk and the United States were looking at this as really American land, but it had actually been shared land between the Americans and the British since a treaty in 1818 that was renewed indefinitely in 1827. It had a one-year opt-out clause, but under the existing agreement, this was shared land. Now, James Polk was saying, well, maybe it shouldn't be shared land anymore. He was a president caught up in this manifest destiny notion of spreading the American system of government across all of North America. He was recognizing that the Americans had about a 10-to-1 advantage in population in this area, with about 7,000 settlers now in the Oregon Territory, and he was ready to fight for this region. He said in his inaugural address that our title to the country of Oregon is clear and unquestionable, and already are our people preparing to perfect that title by occupying it with their wives and children. He decided to pursue an agreement with the British that the British completely rejected. They thought this was their land. Polk decided to play some hardball, and he exercised that opt-out clause. 1 year, and the agreement would be null and void. So now the clock is ticking on both sides, and they decided to actually have an agreement. Now, this is all taking place at the time when the Americans might be going to war with Mexico, so pretty much inclined to try to do this without going to war, and eventually the British agreed to a deal at the 49th parallel. Originally, there was this sort of 54-40 or fight notion where the Americans wanted to go all the way to the 54th parallel, but Polk agreed, let's settle at the 49th, and the British accepted this, and really this settled the border for the United States now with the Webster-Ashburton deal, and now this one here in the Oregon Territory across the continent, the border finally pretty much stable for the Americans and the Canadians. Big push for the Americans and the Canadians would be in the area of trade going forward into the 20th century, and here we take a look at President William Taft. A lot of times in the 19th century, this was about tariffs going back and forth, but Taft was among those who believed in reciprocity agreements. Could we maybe have a free trade deal with an ally like Canada? And so in 1911, he proposed a free trade deal. It was debated on both sides. Both sides seemed to be agreeing, and in fact, the United States Senate agreed to that treaty. But then the Speaker of the House, Champ Clark, opened his mouth and made the following statement. According to Clark, I am for this reciprocity bill because I hope to see the day when the American flag will float over every square foot of the British North American possessions, clear to the North Pole. They are people of our blood. They speak our language. Their institutions are much like ours. They are trained in the difficult art of self-government. Well, this statement did not go over well in Canada. It sounded like another push by the Americans to annex Canada, not just a free trade deal, but actually to take over Canada. In fact, the Canadian government that had negotiated this agreement actually fell over this, and the entire deal collapsed. It would be another 77 years when the North American Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA, came along, that the United States and Canada would have more of this reciprocity agreement when it came to trade. A couple other notes in the U.S.-Canadian relations. The first American president to speak on Canadian soil was Warren Harding. This was returning from his tour of the Alaska Territory in 1923. Very folksy, popular president at the time. Harding made the statement, I like that word neighbors. I like the sort of neighbors who borrow eggs over the back fence, talking about U.S.-Canadian relations. Unfortunately for Harding, a couple of days later, he got sick, and within a week, he was dead, and the United States moved on to its next president with Calvin Coolidge taking over. Canada was certainly an ally for the Americans in World War II, fighting alongside, particularly on D-Day in the attack against the Atlantic Wall of the Germans there in Normandy. Juno Beach was the home for much of the Canadian assault there. The Canadians also part of the deal after the war to join the Americans in NATO, the North American Treaty Organization. Again, sort of go up against the communists of Russia. Canada and the United States part of that agreement as well. One final agreement to talk about was of a trade nature, but also of infrastructure. President Dwight Eisenhower focused some of his administration on domestic infrastructure with his highway plan, but he also looked north for a chance to sort of expand on what the Erie Canal originally did to connect the Midwest all the way to the Atlantic Ocean, and this was to leverage the St. Lawrence Seaway opportunity. And this would be a joint agreement between the Americans and the Canadians to co-develop. Eventually, 2,300 miles would go from Duluth, Minnesota on Lake Superior to Chicago, Milwaukee, Detroit, eventually into Canada via Lake Ontario, and then to the St. Lawrence River all the way to the Atlantic Ocean. 2,300 miles, greatly expanding trade opportunities for sort of the Midwest area of both Canadians and the Americans. This was finally put into place in June 26th of 1959. President Eisenhower joined by Queen Elizabeth of Britain for the ceremony, when Ike said that, look, he called this product a magnificent symbol of the achievements possible to democratic nations peacefully working together for the common good. the establishment of the St. Lawrence Seaway. More recently, again, you have the NAFTA agreement in the late 1980s, a trade agreement that has been superseded by the USMCA, the US-Mexican-Canada agreement, which is the standing trade agreement between the two countries. As for Annex Canada, well, there you get some of the history of the United States' attempts at that in the past and where we stand right now and a little bit of how we got there. For more information on some of these topics, check out those links in the description to other episodes of Presidential Chronicles, take you into more detail on some of this stuff. Check out my books on Amazon.com. Don't forget to subscribe to this YouTube channel. For now, I'm David Fisher, and this is Presidential Perspectives from Presidential Chronicles.